So with the Socratic method, typically here's how dialectic would play out. First of all, you would have Socrates meeting up with someone, and they typically begin talking non-philosophically. So, for example, in the Ion, which is about poetry and rhapsodes, Socrates is heading forward to his trial in apology, and he runs into, or actually, no, it's a different one. He's walking around town, runs into Ion, this rhapsode, and rhapsode has just won this first prize of rhapsody. And rhapsodes are people who present the plays. And Socrates, talks to him. Then they get into the discussion of, about poetry and knowledge, etc. And so typically you have Socrates running to somebody, they chat a little bit, and then quickly it turns to a philosophical discussion. So, for example, when he's talking to Ion, starts off with like, oh, Ion, great melody, great job, and then it gets into what is the subject matter or what do poets know. The next step, when Socrates has got going philosophically, is typically a key concept will come up. Now, the person Socrates is talking to is usually extremely confident that they know what this concept means. So maybe something like justice, or virtue, or beauty. And the person will confidently say they know what beauty is, so they know what justice is, that they know their stuff. They're super confident. Then Socrates will profess that he doesn't know what they mean, that he's confused by their account, that there are problems with it. And he'll ask them to clarify. And initially the person will be super confident. They think they know what justice is, or virtue. And they'll sort of tell Socrates, oh, it's this. And then Socrates will say, well, that's interesting, but there's a couple of problems with that. And then there'll be this cycle of repeating. The person will confidently say, oh yes, I can fix this up. And then Socrates will say, thank you, well and good, but just these other few points. And then eventually the person's confidence will diminish and diminish as they realize, as the cycle goes on, that they really don't know what they're talking about. So their initial confidence was misplaced. And this usually comes to, one of two possible endings. In either case, the person realizes what they were so confident about, virtue or justice or love, they don't actually know. And so they either say, thank you, Socrates, let's go and do some philosophy, or they say, oh, look at the time, I've got to go off and do something else. And so that's typically how the dialogues often go. So it starts up, key concept in play, Socrates professes that he's not sure what he means and that he's confused by it. The person confidently clarifies it, gives a better definition. Socrates raises more questions, and then gradually the person's confidence is ground down until they realize they know what they're talking about. And so either they say, hey, let's go sort this out, or they say, yeah, that's enough of that, and leave Socrates. So that's the stages of the dialectic. Now, in terms of the methodology, and this is the actual Socratic method, here's how you do it. Now, one of his key methodologies was argumentation, and this still works to this day. I mean, even though he was Socratizing way back in ancient Greece, people haven't changed really at all, and so you can use the same sort of stuff. And what Socrates is doing here is pretty much standard stuff in critical thinking and logic. Still taught today because it still works. Just like rhetoric. Aristotle, a good bit for Aristotle, laid out the foundation for rhetoric a couple thousand years ago, and it's still taught today because it still works, because people still feel the same way. We have cooler gadgets, but we still basically operate the same way. Now, as I mentioned, usually the way a Socratic dialogue Socratizes is there's a key concept like justice or virtue, and what the person Socrates is talking to believes is they truly understand it. They've got a great definition. So what Socrates will typically do is find a flaw in that definition. Say, that's interesting, but. Now again, this is something that can still be used obviously today, because people still use definitions. So if you want to engage in, Socratic method of argumentation, you would have, a definition someone's presenting, whatever they're talking about, and here's how you would, Socratize it. Now, one way definitions can go bad is having a structural flaw. Metaphorically speaking, it's analogous to a structural flaw like in a building. Now, in general, if you have a house, would you want to buy a house with a structural flaw? Why not? Wouldn't that be cool? No, because it's in danger of collapsing. That'd probably be bad. So metaphorically speaking, what Socrates is doing is, it's kind of like, looking at a house, inspecting a house, and he's pointing out, structural flaws. Metaphorically, like cracks in the foundation and, other defects. Now, one defect, and this is still a standard problem today, is a definition that runs in a circular definition. And the problem is that if a definition runs you in a circle, you don't learn anything, because you just circle back to where you were. For example, if someone defines writer's block as being unable to write because one line is blocked, well, the person said words, but you just said writer's block is a block of writing, which just repeats what is said. Now, in some cases, the circularity would be obvious, like with that. In other cases, the circle may be a little bigger. Interestingly, the kind of a fundamental problem is, eventually, you might notice that all the words in the dictionary just take you to other words, which take you back to the original word. But somehow we're able to figure out what's going on. So it really is a matter of how tight the circle is. So if you can show that a definition is circular, it just runs someone in a circle, then that's a problem with the definition. It's not a good one. The second problem is when someone presents the parts, things that fall under the definition, but takes them to be the whole thing. For example, if someone is trying to define morality in terms of, say, justice or honesty or virtues, and those would be part of it, but not the whole thing. And the problem there is that, well, kind of obvious, it's taking what is not the whole concept and taking a piece of it to define the whole thing. And obviously that's not going to work. Thirdly, the definition is simply a list of examples. Now, in this case, there can be cases where this is okay. Now, the problem, of course, with giving a list of examples is, in part, practical. For example, suppose I say Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Lincoln. What am I defining? Could be presidents, could also be...
Money.
Yeah, it could be money. Could be dead people. Could be last names. Could be Americans. Could be streets. Probably schools, probably some schools. So it could be many things. And so one problem with a list of examples is it can fit many, many things. Now, this is not to say, one thing to be careful about though, is there is a type of definition that's legitimate called, well, basically definition by example. Now, in that case, you define things by giving examples. But again, kind of the problem with it is that simply giving...
First two is fallacy, policy, right?
Yeah, to be, or the circularity, one would be, if it's involving reasoning, it would be circular reasoning. And yeah, if someone's mistaking saying what's true of the parts is true of the whole, that particular move would be the fallacy of composition. So he considers those to be 3 flaws in definitions. And again, this is stuff that still works today. So if a definition has those problems, then it's still defective. Now we saw the reductio ad absurdum in the past. This is also something Socrates developed, and the methodology remains the same. So what Socrates would do is take somebody's definition and show that it leads to absurdity. And if it leads to absurdity, the definition can't be correct. And this is, again, this still works today. Last two structural flaws, and this is, again, standard stuff in critical thinking, is the method of counterexample. Now, if you have a perfect definition, in the ideal sense, what it does is present necessary and sufficient conditions. And this means the following. A sufficient condition for something, in terms of definition, means if something has those qualities, then it is that thing. So if you have a definition of triangle that's sufficient, that means if something meets that definition, it's a triangle. A necessary condition is such that you gotta have those qualities to be that thing. So if you have a necessary definition for a triangle, it means something can't be a triangle unless it has those things. Now if you have them both together, that means if something has those qualities, it would be that thing, say a triangle. And if it is a triangle, it is that thing. If it doesn't have those qualities, it's not a triangle. It'd be a perfect definition. Now if you had a perfect definition, you could take that definition and sort out the universe. You just take your standards and you'd be able to take, you know, whatever it is you're talking about, triangles or art or justice, and build, you know, two metaphorical pies. All the just things, all the unjust things. Now, as you might imagine, there are very few perfect definitions. There's always some type of defect. And the classic way of showing the definition is bad, and this works with almost any definition, because you can always show, you know, unless it's a perfect definition, which are pretty rare, you can almost always show a defect. The first one is this. Definition that is too broad. The other one is too narrow. So what does that mean? Well, to use a metaphor, a definition is supposed to be like a gatekeeper or like a firewall on your computer. And the idea is this. If someone's a bouncer at a nightclub, what's their main job? Or the door person at a nightclub, exclusive nightclub, with their little clipboard and stabbing pencil.
People in
Yeah, because people that go in are supposed to be on the
list.
list. And if they're not on the list, yeah, they're not supposed to go in. So that person's job is to make sure the right people go in and the wrong people are kept out. Same with the definition. The definition is supposed to let in the right stuff and keep out the wrong stuff. Similarly, the firewall on your computer is supposed to do the same thing. It's supposed to let in stuff you want, like your email, web pages, and keep out stuff you don't want, like malware of various sorts. Now definitions are supposed to do the same thing. They're supposed to let in the right stuff and keep out the wrong stuff. So if you can show that a definition lets in too much, then it's a bad definition. If you can show a definition keeps out things that should be in there, that's also a bad definition. So for example, suppose we're trying to define the term person. If we define person as having human DNA, well, that's too broad, because tumors, human tumors, have human DNA. But is a brain tumor a person or human? No, it's just, you know, tumors. So, similar like our skin, when we shed our, you know, we shed skin cells all the time. They have human DNA, but they're not people, because that would be super weird. Now, that definition is also too narrow, because there could be entities, in fact there were, that are people that don't have Homo sapiens DNA. For example, Neanderthals. They're not Homo sapiens, they're Neanderthals, but they were people. Similarly for some other species. Or if you want to get sci-fi, if you like you know, fantasy, works of fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, things like elves and dwarves, not human, but people. If you like sci-fi, things like, you know, Vulcans and so forth, they be people, but not human. So that definition would be bad because it lets in.
So you're saying that you have to just specify like everything in general, and you have to come up with, well,
Yeah, because a perfect definition would be like a perfect door person. Everything that's supposed to be in there under that concept, like person or justice, gets in, so nothing is left out, and nothing that shouldn't be in there is let in. So all the right stuff is in the club, and all the wrong stuff is outside. And that'd be a perfect definition. And anyone, ideally the way it would work is, if a person was reasonable and rational and they saw the definition, they would say, yeah, everything that, intuitively, everything that should be in there is in there, everything that shouldn't be is kept out. And that would be a perfect definition. Now, things that people aren't too emotionally attached to, and that are very kind of simple, we have good definitions for. For example, in geometry, we have perfect definitions for triangles and squares. Why? Well, one is, it's pretty simple. Triangles, easy to define. Also, do people get really like emotionally upset about triangles? Do people like fight in the streets over triangles and polygons and stuff? We have like gangs centered around geometric figures. The triangles and the quadrilaterals. That'd be weird. So not a lot of emotion stuff. But now when you get to complex things, like justice, we have a lot of debate about what should be in there, what shouldn't be. And then if we get things that are very emotionally laden, like equality and fairness, then it gets even more complicated, more difficult, because it's complicated and people have a lot of emotional, stuff going on there. Which is so, when you take things like justice or equality or fairness, those are heavily debated because they're complex notions and people have a lot of emotional, responses to them. So if you're trying to sort out like what is a fair distribution of wealth in society or what is equal opportunity, you'll have a lot of fighting. So the way you can attack a definition is try to show it's too broad. Show that it lets in too much, things that shouldn't be there. To show that it's too narrow, show that it keeps out stuff that should be in there. And you can show something is both. If you're building a definition, then you want to avoid that. You want to try to make sure it lets in everything that should be in and keeps out the stuff that shouldn't. And again, this is still a standard tool today. If you take critical thinking or logic and it covers definitions, this will be mentioned. Before pressing on, anything about that needs more stuff? Reasoning and definitions. Now, our good dead friend Socrates, another contribution he made was inductive reasoning, which you saw before. Now, people engaged in inductive reasoning before Socrates, otherwise they'd be dead, but Socrates kind of laid out some formal reasoning. And one of his main contributions was the generalization, where basically you go from particular stuff to the general. Now, this is one reason why today, wrongly, sometimes people will say that inductive reasoning is going from the specific to the general, which is not the case. Inductive reasoning is not about whether you're going broad to narrow or narrow to broad. It's about probability. Socrates is also known for, again, probably wasn't like the first person to talk about universal definitions, but he laid this out, at least Plato has him laying this out. And the idea here is this. He believed that you could have universal definitions for things. And this ties into something we'll see in part 3, namely the notion of universals and natural categories. And one thing that's a subject of debate in the sciences and philosophy is, are there natural categories of things? And if there are, what are they? Now, Plato's term was metaphorical, about carving the beast of reality along the joints. The idea being that dividing the world up as it's really divided. And again, this is something that is, of interest in metaphysics. What are the universals, if any, but it also has implications in, the social sciences and ethics. What natural categories are there? Are things like gender and race, are those real categories, or are they constructs we make up? Now, another contributions Socrates made was in the area of metaphysics. We'll see a bit of this in the Apology. Now, one of the main focuses in Socrates' metaphysics was concern about the soul, or the psyche. Now, the Greeks, not surprisingly, had a wide range of views. One view was that there is no survival after death. Just, the body's alive, then you die, and then the soul's gone. But of course, the Greeks did, at least in some cases, notions of like ghost and afterlife. Now, Socrates, in some cases, does seem to think there is a soul that keeps on going. Although, when you see in the Apology, he argues maybe there is, and also maybe not. Later on, in Plato's later dialogues, like the Republic, Socrates explicitly argues for reincarnation. In the Republic, at the end of it, he talks about how after you die, you go to hang out with these entities known as the forms, more on them in part 3, for 1,000 years. At the end of 1,000 years, you go and you pick your new life. So it's kind of a weird scenario where you go and you spend 1,000 years learning stuff, and then you go, it's almost like a video game, like you're picking your character. You go and you look at like what kind of life you're going to have, and then you pick it, and then you lead that life. Now, one implication that in a way can be kind of horrifying is that if Socrates is right, everyone picks their life. So they in a way deserve everything they get, because it's all in that list. And he gives the example on how someone grabs the life of being a king, but doesn't read the fine print and realize they're going to end up being like a murderer and do terrible, terrible things, and then be like slaughtered themselves. They're like, this is great, I'm a king. And then they're like, oh crap, didn't read the fine print. So the lesson there is always read the fine print. Now, when you get to the Apology, one thing we'll see, of course, spoilers, is that Socrates is on trial. Now, typically the way trials work, unless someone's like super rich, is they lock people up and the person's got to wait in jail for their trial. Or they have to put down like a big cash bail. Because the worry in many trials is what? Why do they have like bail, or why do they lock people up before trials? What might someone do? They think they're going to be like tried for some type of crime. Yeah, they might take off, head to someplace like Mexico or Canada or New Jersey or someplace. Now, in Socrates' case, he just walks to his trial. They didn't lock him up, he just shows up, and as we'll see, he's found guilty and sentenced to death. And before the trial, he could have easily just kind of run off. And after, we're not going to read the Crito, but in the dialogue after the Apology, Socrates' friends have bribed the guards, they've come to bust him out, and Socrates decides to stay and die. So an interesting question is, why did Socrates, just walk to his trial with every seeming intent of getting himself killed, and why did he stick around to get killed? Well, the answer is his moral theory. He falls under, and we'll see more of this in part 4, under the general category of being a virtue theorist. And a virtue theorist believes what it is to be moral is to have the virtues, the standard things like courage, honesty, etc. Now, one of the classic questions in ethics, one we all have to answer, is why be moral? And this generally assumes that evil is more appealing, because the question is not, why be evil? The question is, why should I bother to be good? And the presumption is that people really want to be evil, and you got to persuade them to not be evil. And in the Republic, Socrates tries to answer this question. Now, his answer, but again, spoilers here, is basically this: that evil may seem to have advantages, here, but his claim is that evil, even if the person is never caught and punished, by other people, and gets wealth and power and success, his view is essentially that evil will consume the soul, that that essentially evil brings along its own punishment. It's like inviting a demon into one's house, that even though the demon's bringing all kinds of cool stuff, you're hanging out with a demon, and that's not going to go well. And he believes that someone who's good, even if they're not getting wealth and power, they'll be better off. And it's a fundamental question, in life. Are you better off, being evil when you can get all kinds of advantages, or should you be good even though it may cost you like all the other wealth and power and influence? And not surprisingly, Socrates says you should be good. Now, his view of ethics is what's called ethical intellectualism. And what this means is this, that to know the good is to do the good. And the reason why people are bad, because one important question is, why are people bad? If good is so great, his claim is this: people are evil because of ignorance. That if they knew what was good, they would do that. Now, he doesn't mean here by knowledge that people don't know that stabbing people can hurt other people, etc. What he means is philosophical understanding of the good. So it's not that bad people are missing, facts about how stuff works, is they lack this philosophical wisdom. And his claim is, if someone had true wisdom, true knowledge, they would not be bad. Now, on one hand, that view does have a certain appeal. For example, one of the major purposes of public service announcements, like you might have heard of the old, this is your brain on drugs campaign. What are those campaigns supposed to do? Yeah, because they're supposed to inform you that drugs are bad. And the assumption is that people don't know drugs are bad. If only they knew, they would what? Yeah, they'd stop doing drugs. The old G.I. Joe cartoon would have maybe they still do this on cartoons, but they would have knowing is half the battle. And they'd always have after they're like shooting people, they would have a little moral lesson and say, knowing is half the battle or something like that, or the more you know. The idea being that if you knew this stuff, people would be good. That if you just knew things, we'd be good. And then we do bad stuff because we don't know. And in some cases in real life, people do make that claim. They'll say that they didn't know what they were doing was bad, and once they learn stuff, they stop being bad. Now, even in Socrates' time, there were critics of this. Aristotle said, kind of politely, that it contradicted the known facts. Other people were less kind, saying this was just stupid. That it's not that people who are evil don't know, they lack knowledge, they're evil for other reasons. So, and it's a basic question. Could you be a wise person and know things and still be evil? And Socrates say nope. And other people say, yep. Now, as a closing point, also the debate about why people do terrible things like engage in school shootings, etc., or mass shootings, people raise that question. Why do people do that? And one answer is because they're terrible people. But sometimes people say, well, they didn't know any better, they weren't raised right, that it was society's failings. And so we're still wrestling with those questions. Whenever something terrible happens, we always ask, why did that occur? And we give a lot of answers, media, parents, etc. And we still really don't know for sure. So the reason why Socrates shows up for his trial is because he believes that he's got to be virtuous. He's got to do the right thing, even if it kills him. And it does. Now, so why was he in trouble? Well, one reason, as we saw, was that wisdom thing. He went around, would show people to be fools in public. And how happy are people in power when someone shows that they don't know what they're doing? Like, for example, how stoked is Trump about that Bob Woodward book? Is he like saying, you gotta read this book? He's not happy about that at all. And as you might imagine, back in Socrates' time, he's presenting, criticizing people in public, showing them to be fools, and they're not happy about it. Now, another reason why he was in trouble is because he didn't trust democracy, didn't like democracy. Yet, he believes that he should obey the law, which in a way is kind of a tension, because he thinks that the political system of Athens has got it wrong, yet he still shows up for the trial. So why distrust democracy? Well, it's actually a pretty good argument. It goes roughly like this. Now, use an analogy that Socrates does. Suppose you have a terrible pain in your side. Suddenly you collapse to the floor. Do you take a poll, a vote of the people around you to see what should be done? No, why not? You say quickly, we must vote to see what I have. Yeah, because people, unless there's nurses or doctors around one, they don't know. They can guess. Appendicitis maybe a bad bagel, but who knows? Yeah, so when it comes to things like medicine, or suppose your car suddenly stops, do you hop out and say, fellow citizens, let us vote and see what is wrong with my car and how we may repair it? No, you take it to a mechanic. Or if your computer's not working, you wouldn't say, let us take a vote to see what I should do. Then you take it to someone who knows. So all the important stuff in life, we don't put it to a vote, we go to find someone who knows stuff, and we have them do the work. Now in democracy, what we're doing is basically putting stuff to a vote. So what should we do about North Korea? Well, let's have an election, put someone in office. Do we base it on their having knowledge? Typically, no. Similarly, when we're voting on, well, we have constitutional amendments coming up, quite a few. If you're registered to vote in Florida, you get a chance to potentially change the Florida Constitution, making a lasting mark. Now, in that case, are we experts about that stuff? Most people no. Yet we get to make that decision. Will we get it right? Maybe, yeah, maybe not. Yeah, so the thing about voting is most people don't know. And so we're basically saying, okay, so what should we nuke Korea? All in favor. What should we do about medical marijuana? All in favor. What should we do about this? And so essentially we're having people who are experts, because everyone's vote is equal, whether someone carefully research, if you spend, suppose you're one of those people that spends hours, you look up all the candidates and all the issues, and you vote, and someone else just sits there and just like Christmas trees the ballot, how much does their vote count? So just the same as yours. All the work is not, it's not like a test. So his criticism is that democracy, doesn't make any sense. Because with other things that are important, we turn to people who know what they're doing. In the case of democracy, we're just voting, and it's mostly people who don't know. So we're going to get bad decisions. So does that repudiate democracy? Are there any other reasons why we should have voting for stuff? But what about making choices in your life? Would your life potentially go better if you had someone who was like an expert in life making all your choices for you? I know mine would have. Because looking back on some decisions, those were bad choices. Yeah, so if I had someone who was like an expert, someone who's not someone who's like trying to mess you, screw you over, be like some. But imagine there was someone who was just really great at life. They would study you carefully, like a coach, like a true life coach. And they, just like you have people who are professional coaches for running and baseball and stuff, and they would go and make good choices for you. could your life turn out better with like an expert? You're carefully analyzing all your choices, getting your values and optimizing your choices.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. But would you want that? Would you want someone, even though they guarantee better outcomes for you, would you want someone running your life? No, why not? Even if they could say, so subjectively, you knew they would make better choices. Like, they would find a job you would enjoy, they would maximize your income, you know, they're there for your good. Or would you still rather make your own choices? Yeah, because it's your life, you know, because if someone else is picking all the optimal stuff for you, it's not your life anymore. You're just doing what they say. Even if they're making better choices for you, and this is what, you know, parents often say, this is for your own good. And in some cases that can be a good idea, like not drinking bleach or something. But at a certain point, you know, when you're an adult, you want to make your own choices, even if you know you're going to make bad choices, because we all make a lot of bad choices. Yeah, so one argument for democracy would be is, yes, we may not make the best choice, but it's our choice. So if we're not choosing ourselves, it's not our life anymore. It's not our government anymore. Also, one interesting thing they found, a philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, predicted this, and science bears them out. If people, even if they're not experts in the field, if they work on a problem and do so without like prejudice or bias or being like screwed up by political ideology, they do very well. It's called the wisdom of the crowds. Now, once you start throwing in politics and crap, then it all, you know, gets blown to hell. But if you have a group of people, even non-experts, working at a problem, they'll do quite well. And you know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had this notion called the general will, that people, when they're not being sort of subverted and led astray by, you know, partisan politics, they come up with good decisions. And so it may be the case that Socrates is wrong, that if you have people, you know, under the right conditions, they'll make good choices. I mean, a good example of this is how bees and ants make decisions. Individual ants and bees aren't very smart, but as a collective, they make very good choices, like where to put their nest, etc. And they found that humans do the same thing. Even though individually we have no idea what the heck we're doing, if you have enough of us in a group, then in making choices without bias and prejudice and stuff, we can make good decisions. So then, why did Socrates decide to stay? Well, again, part of it is virtue theory. Another reason is that Socrates believed that people should obey the laws. And he puts forth what we now call social contract theory, also along with this natural law theory. And here's the idea. Social contract theory really got rolling in the Enlightenment. People like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin. The idea of social contract theory is this. It tries to address the question of what is the justification for political authority? When do other people have the right to tell us what to do? And social contract theory says this. When you agree to the system of government, then that is what the foundation of political authority is. You know, government of the people. The idea being that we have to decide of our own free choice to say we're going to go along with this. Now, this is important in part because it's the theory for the justification of political authority in the United States. We don't have a king, we have our president who's elected, and the authority of the president rests on our agreement. We agree to vote, and we agree, kinda, to the Electoral College, and so it's our agreement, our contract, that justifies the system. So why is Donald Trump our president? And the answer is, we agree to the system. And sometimes the system, just like to use a small scale analogy, if you're with a group of friends and you're going to the movies, and you say, okay, we're gonna vote on which movie we see, we're all gonna go along with it. What obligates you to go along, even if it's a movie you hate, is that you agreed to the vote. And if you don't go along with it, you've broken your word, the social contract. Now, Socrates believed that he had an agreement with the state, that a tacit agreement, that he was born in Athens, and Athens allowed people, when they became adults, they could pack up their stuff and leave. But if they stay, they agree to obey. And Socrates says, well, you know, he stayed there as an adult, he benefited from the state, he agreed to stay. He has a contract with the state. And if he takes off, then he breaks that agreement. And again, this is, even though Socrates is Socratizing back in ancient Greece, this is the foundation of Western political legitimacy today. Why do our states have legitimacy? And the theory is that we have agreed to give them legitimacy. And if we withdraw our agreement, then the state loses legitimacy. This is why, at least in my opinion, this is just my opinion, that any time actions are taken to deprive people of a right to vote, the legitimacy of the state is reduced. So the more citizens who are deprived of the right to vote, say by felony disenfranchisement, voter suppression, etc., the state's legitimacy drops off because there are people who are being compelled to follow the rules that don't get representation. They get taxation without representation. And so if we believe that legitimacy is based on social contract, to the degree that people are, their right to participate is suppressed, the legitimacy of the state is destroyed and lost. Again, opinion on my part, which could be wrong. Natural law theory. Now, this is also the foundation of Western political thought. The United States and other Western countries accept, well, in theory at least, accept natural law theory. And here's the idea. Now, where do laws come from, in general? Yeah. And government is made up of? Yeah, people. So literally we make that crap up. You know, we have people in, you know, here in Tallahassee, the state capital, sit around just making stuff up. And then we have people in Washington just making stuff up. And then they put them out there as law. Now, natural law theory is the view that beyond, above these laws that we just make up, there is an objective moral assessment of these laws that you can apply. And the reason why it's called natural law theory is that there is a natural moral order beyond the laws that you can use to criticize those laws, to say whether the laws are just or unjust. Now, this is explicitly accepted in the United States. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, we get our right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, not from the government. So it's not something people, at least according to the people who wrote it, it's not something that's just made up. We get those rights from where? Well, Declaration of Independence says we are endowed by our Creator with the rights of, unalienable rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And so the idea is that we have these rights, they don't come from the state, therefore we're not beholden to the state for those rights. And the state, you know, we're in a way protected morally from the state by those rights. Now, one reason why this is very important is because when you accept natural law theory, you have an objective moral platform on which you can stand to criticize the state. A good example is the American Civil Rights Movement. Because if laws are just crap people make up, then there's really no, you really can't say this better or worse because it's just whatever we make up. But if you believe that people are endowed with a right to life and liberty and believe in a principle of equality, then you have grounds to criticize laws. So if there are laws that are not recognizing people's right to liberty, not recognizing equality, then you can criticize those laws and say these laws are violating these moral standards. So one thing that has enabled, at least in the United States, however flawed we are, to have this improvement, have this criticism, is this notion of natural law theory. Because baked right into the Declaration of Independence is the idea that there are rights and morality that go beyond just people making stuff up. And hence we're able to criticize our laws as being unjust and unfair. Which is, if you want a better country seems like a pretty good idea, because then you can say this is wrong, or this is pretty good. Okay, so next time, more Socrates. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you on the Friday.